So thank you for having me here. It's super exciting to be here, especially as a geographer. It's not really like the discipline that gets the most attention. So it's really fun to be able to come and talk, especially here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my company, Fraym. Then I'll tell you a little bit about like how Fraym connects to the geospatial world and the international development world and how I got here. So Fraym is a small startup. We're like 6 or 7 years old. We're based in the DC area. And it started out of the desire to find more local level data, mostly socioeconomic data and demographic data in data poor environments. And we started in Africa, but we've since then expanded to the whole globe. So we use machine learning and AI to help take data that's regularly available at a much more aggregate level, and then take that to a local level and then help decision makers answer questions that they might have. And we are really working across a lot of different sectors. We work a lot with ministries on the ground. We work with planning officials. We work across verticals such as international development, which I'm going to talk a lot about because that's my background. We also work in national security and in the commercial side too. And this is just a few of our places that we work right now. So I already talked about who we are, a little bit about how we do this. For those of you in the room, how many are geography or computer science majors? Oh, good. Okay, a lot of you. So I see my husband. I think it's him. He's not a geographer. He is a computer science major. So how we work with our data is we collect household level data from these big aggregate surveys put out by places like the US Agency for International Development or the World Bank. They're called the Demographic Health Survey, the DHS, or we use other kinds of surveys that are looking at nationally representative populations, and they gather all kinds of information, like things like gendered issues, asset ownership, education. There's certain modules that collect information on health status and things like that. But that's all at a very aggregated level. So we take that data and we bring in other forms of spatial data. We use a lot of satellite imagery. We use other point location and other kinds of spatial data. And then we build out algorithms that allow us to interpolate that data down to a 1 square kilometer grid. And then that we use for our analytical products. And so we have 3 sort of buckets of the types of products we produce. Some people just want the data, and so we can produce the data for them. And then they can take it and run with it in a GIS or in their planning or their, we'll do this a lot with groups that already have a technology team or a geospatial team in place. But the majority of people that we work with don't have that skill set. And so for them, we will build out either these dashboards I'm going to show you, which we call Data Fraym, which is a web-based mapping platform that doesn't require any kind of GIS skills and allows you to do a little bit of analytics. And then the most common is what I think is the most fun is we build out analytic products for decision makers. And so we have a lot of people in our team who have a lot of expertise in statistics analysis, some GIS, and they are able to use the data to answer really interesting questions. And I'm going to show a little bit about that. Okay. So I have sort of 2 case studies that I thought would be interesting to share. These are ones that we're working on immediately. And I think, we work on, I'd say right now we have maybe 24 active projects across a whole lot of topics, but these 2 I think are really pertinent. One is our Ukraine data. So sometimes, like I said, we capture that data through these big international publicly available data sets. But what we're finding is because of COVID, and then also just because of the funding cycles of those organizations, those data sets are not very current. So we'll be lucky if we've got data from like 2018, 2019. And for a lot of people, they don't really want to know what happened in 2018. They really want to know what's happening now. So what we've started in the last year is combining our own primary data collection and our data science team to figure out how do we properly sample, where do we sample, what kind of clusters do we need to capture to get something that we can then interpolate down to that local level. And so the great thing about this is we can ask our own questions and we can ask anything we want. And we can start to get at beyond just asset ownership and demographic information, but attributes like attitudinal data. Like how do you feel about the Russians coming to your country? Or things like not just do you own a television or do you listen to the radio, but which social media channels do you watch more often and which radio stations do you listen to? And we can actually provide them the lists that are available to them, and we get really, really localized data. So I'm going to give an example for how this is being used in Ukraine. So in Ukraine, we ran a survey in February, and it actually finished, it wrapped up, I think it was 2 weeks before the invasion or a week before the invasion, because we were really pushing to get it done because we had a feeling that that was going to happen. And so because of that, we tailored the questions to two areas: the humanitarian side for international development and some of the national security side that we thought that our national security partners might be interested in, of how people were feeling on the ground. And this is like a little sample of some of the relevant indicators that we were able to capture. And like I said, it really covered, this slide deck covers a lot of the information and disinformation, because this was an area that we knew was really going to be important, especially since the Russian media and the Russian government were pushing a lot of misinformation into Ukraine. And then we were able to map out also things like cultural identities, ethnic identities, and demographic type information at the local level too. So what you see on that map is each of those one little squares is 1 square kilometer. And this is looking at people who are speaking Russian natively at home. And if you zoom in, you can see Kharkiv, and then you can get the information. And this is using our system, which I'll show in a second. And this allows people who are working to target groups on the ground for assistance, really, really valuable information about what they're doing. So in this case, we were learning that Facebook and YouTube are really popular choices for social media communications in these particular areas. So if you were running a campaign and you really wanted to target a certain population, you would know that these would be your go-tos. The other thing that came out of this was super interesting is that a fairly large percentage, about 1/5 of the population, listens or watches this 112 television news station, which is owned by pro-Russian politicians. And so this is a really important note that that's where a lot of them are getting their media. We can also start to look at change over time. And this actually doesn't show that. This is showing more about attitudinal changes. And we can ask, you'll see in the global influence questions, we're getting at what type of favorable opinions they have of different things. So we asked about different types of the US, of Russia, of the EU, of China. But one thing that's really interesting here is that you can compare the selected area that you have gone in and pulled out, which is what are those squares that you see highlighted, with the broader administrative region around it. So in this case, we're comparing the selected area. So it's 4 square kilometers by, so 3 square kilometers, that block, with, I can't see what the bigger administrative unit is, but it's whatever that larger admin unit is, probably admin 2, maybe admin 3 around it. What we can now also do is we're running time series data collection across different areas, usually by quarter. So we don't have this right now for Ukraine, but we are doing it in places like Thailand, in Taiwan, in China, and in other countries where every quarter we're gathering information and then we can see change over time. We're also doing this on COVID, which I'm going to show too in a second. And then this is just all to say that it helps with the countering misinformation that is happening, and we're doing it at a really granular level. You can also see here, there's a lot of other applications. This was like one little area that I chose to show. One other example that I wanted to give that's more on the health side, and this is much more commonly used in the international development space, is around COVID. So in March of 2020, Fraym started mapping out indicators that we thought might be useful for understanding COVID spread. And this was like at the very, very early days of the pandemic. We didn't even really know what was going to be appropriate. So we were looking at things like smoking as a risk and access to fresh water or soap for hand washing. And then we could map that out and we would create these like layers that we gave out for free. We just put them out in the ether and said, if this is useful to anyone, let us know. And the Gates Foundation came to us and said, actually, we'd really like to see these combined in some kind of an index that says, this area is going to be a problem and we're concerned about exposure. So we started building out all these indices that would allow us to rate things like exposure risk or communications risk, because the governments were trying to promote conversations about COVID and all these people didn't have access to the channels that they were using to promote it. From there, we moved more into vaccine allocation and looking at equitable allocations of vaccines. And we worked with UNDP and the Gates Foundation and a few other donors that were really trying to help countries plan. And then from there, we moved pretty quickly into vaccine hesitancy, because what we were seeing, and it was coming out a lot in the media, was that people had access to vaccines in different countries, but they weren't getting them, and we wanted to know why. So I'm going to give an example from South Africa. This was one of the countries that we collected primary data in. So in South Africa, nearly 1 in 4 South Africans report that they do not know if they will receive a COVID-19 vaccine. And so what you're seeing here is the breakdown of people who said, absolutely no, I don't want it. Like, don't even talk to me about it. That's that 25% group. The I'm kind of on the fence, I'm somewhat hesitant is that 22%. And then the yeah, I'm getting it is the 53. We were really interested in targeting that 22% that were like maybe, but I'm not sure why. And when we started to dig into the rationale and the reasons that they were giving, we learned that it was really driven by things like access. They were too far from health centers, or they were afraid of the cost, or they couldn't take time off from work, or they didn't trust the government, or they were less educated and were getting less information that was accurate about COVID. And then also there was a racial component as well. So 55% identified as Black African, while 29% identified as white, and only 10% were identifying as colored. And so those populations then were an area that you could really target for messaging to help them feel like they had access that they didn't before. So we developed this model that's based on the WHO's model, which we're calling, I think this is actually what they call it. It's the 3 C's model, and it measures confidence, convenience, and complacency. And each of those groups are what combine to create this hesitancy range spectrum. So we developed this as a model to get at that hesitancy piece. So if you start at let me start at the middle. So that confidence, convenience, and complacency, you can break each of those sections into indicators that will help you figure out how to get up to that broader level. So for example, under confidence, we looked at safety and efficacy and disinformation with the government. And then underneath that, those blue boxes are the actual indicators that we gathered to get to that level. So they all roll up into vaccine hesitancy. And the spatial component here is that for every one of these locations, we have a location, a geocord that goes with it. And so then we can start to map and look at areas based on the findings that we're having. So we can look at it from the national level, from the district level, and then from the community level. And you can imagine where this goes in terms of planning and resource allocation and all of that. So a couple examples from this. The first thing is looking at some hotspot analysis that we ran. So we were identifying concentrations of that group that was the somewhat hesitant. And this is then where the government or the aid organizations can use to prioritize geographically. So once they know where they want to head on the community side, then they can start looking in those the top priorities that I just shared a minute ago around the different populations. And you can see the percentage of those populations and the actual number of people. And then we also broke out those demographic characteristics so that we know, based on the data that we're finding in those particular communities, which of those somewhat hesitant groups we want to really target. And this is running a regression, so you could actually see the populations you want to hit. I'm trying to see if there's anything else here that I really want to talk about. This was more around the kind of campaign that could be run and how to target them. Again, it's looking at that same kind of thing I talked about with Ukraine around what kind of communication channels are the most effective for those particular population groups in those areas. And then this is looking really specifically at that hyperlocal level at the 1 square kilometer, which we consider like the community level, to help them understand the planners and the Ministry of Health, which communities and which locations they really want to reach out to and how. So that's a little bit about Fraym. The last thing I just want to mention about what we do and who we are is that I mentioned this right at the top. We're a small company. We're about 50 people. We've been growing a lot actually in the last couple of years. And the very exciting thing is that there are now 3 mid-alums at Fraym. So I started in August of 2020. And then for those of you who have been around here a little while, you may know Miles, who just graduated. He's a Feb, or he was a Feb. And James Kipp, who you may not have overlapped at all with because he graduated in 2020. But they came out of different backgrounds. So Miles had a bio major, but he was a comp sci minor. And James was a geography and poli-sci double major. And I'm going to talk about this when we chat a little bit more about job stuff, but both of them had very different backgrounds, and they both ended up actually working in the same unit within Fraym that builds out a lot of that primary data that I was just talking about. And they think through those strategies of how do we collect that data, how do we clean it and harmonize it, and how do we build those stacks that we need to build in order to do all that interpolation. So I think that's probably it for my official presentation. I had an amazing GIS professor named Bob Churchill, who I think is a bit of a legend here now. And I think that really sparked an interest in geography writ large. And then I remember my mom being like, what does that mean? Like, what are you gonna do with that major? Yeah. So I didn't have a path coming in where I was like, yeah, I want to be a geographer. The first thing I'd say, and we talked about this earlier, was internships. And I'm really curious how COVID has impacted people's ability to do internships. For me, that was really important. And I use JTerm often as a time because there were a lot of times where internships were unpaid and I couldn't do that. Like I was not financially in a position to do an unpaid internship. So I used JTerm as a time to do it because I could do it for credit. And so I did an internship at Harvard Public Health School. I did one at the Vermont Department of Public Health. And I think something else that was really important for me was the rigor here and the high expectations, which I actually didn't understand until I was in graduate school. And I went through a graduate program where I was then working as a TA and an RA, a teacher's assistant and a research assistant with undergraduates at a big university, like a Big 10. And it was such a different experience. And the expectations and the bar was set so much lower. And it made me realize how having such high expectations at Middlebury had really pushed me and then made me actually, I think, better professionally later when I was in the work world. I think that as a student, I was really concerned with like taking the right classes to get me to the right job. And I remember my resume in the beginning when I first was applying to jobs, I wanted to like pound on the fact that I'd had GIS I was trying to stretch it out. Like how many years can I say I've done GIS? And I wanted to say like, I've learned, so one thing I was going to mention that I wish I had done is I didn't take anything in the computer science side, which now looking back, I wish I had, but I really was focusing on the hard skills. And now that I am hiring people, what I look for are soft skills. And yeah, your resume needs to show that you can do the work and that you understand the topic. But when we actually get to the interview, and then particularly we do a data case, which is where they present to us their findings, I'm less interested in how they did it. And I'm more interested in how they present how they did it. And part of it is because a lot of what we do is work directly with clients. And so we want to make sure that people are comfortable communicating their ideas. And that is something that I think Middlebury really did a great job of, because everybody has to be forced to present and everybody is communicating through writing constantly. And I didn't quite realize that that wasn't the norm for any college. But it really is something that I think is a skill that Middlebury students have that's great, that is useful later on for sure. So it's kind of like I went like this and then came back. So my 20s, I had a lot of different jobs. And I started off thinking, I was really unsure when I graduated if I wanted to do more health stuff or if I wanted to go more like the natural resource management route. And I just wanted to go away. I grew up in a really small rural community in New England. I'd only ever lived in rural New England and I needed to go away. So I had an opportunity to move out west. And so I went to Montana and I lived in Glacier National Park. And I got a job doing like a consulting job doing some park work for Glacier National Park. And it wasn't really using my skills. It was using my research skills. I wasn't really using GIS skills. So then I got a job, another short-term job in Montana for the city county health department. And it was super boring. And I was the only person that did GIS. And then they put me in like a group with like the county surveyors because they also use GIS. And it was like the stodgy old guy in his late 50s. And he was like all over some software that I had never used before. And I was trying to convince him he should really use Esri and ArcGIS. And he was like, no, we're using, it was AutoCAD. And it was weird. It was like, I did a lot of weird mapping of like crime scenes and things like that. And then I came back here to Vermont and I ended up working for the Forest Service briefly. And I did some GIS work for they do like a plan where they do every 5 years, they do a new plan for the forest. So that was kind of cool. And then I was like, I think I need to go to grad school. That had been like a year of bouncing around. And I, at that point, was starting to feel like I knew I needed to get another degree. I knew I wanted to do stuff with health. So I applied. I looked at professors that I thought would be really good for what I wanted to study. I looked at programs that I thought had a really good track towards the PhD track, which is where I thought I wanted to go. And then I got in and I had all this time. And so I went to Salzburg, Austria, and they used to have a really good program that connected to Middlebury called the Salzburg Seminar. Now it's the Salzburg Global Seminar, I think. And I spent 3 months doing work with people from all over the world on different topics. It was like all over the board. But while I was there, they had a bunch in international development. And having been around a lot of international students at Middlebury and participating in a lot of events that were international, it had always sort of been an interest, but never a focus. And then that really piqued my interest. So I went back to graduate school, got a degree in geography, focused in international development, moved to DC, and my 30s were almost all in the same thing. So I worked for a big NGO that did international development for 6 years, and I did climate change work, and I did GIS, and I did other stuff. And then I moved into a big consulting company that works primarily with the US Agency for International Development. And I was there for 10 years and I bounced around to different positions within the company, but it was always with either environment or data systems or using geospatial information. And I finally just wanted a change and ended up wanting to do something that was more smaller and niche and really tech geo focused where people got it and like understood the value of technology for development. And that's how I ended up at Fraym. And I wanted something that was like more leadership oriented. So I liked that I could come into this and have like affect some change within the organization. I think it's amazing that everybody, so employers are going to differ from what their values are, but there's such a huge trend in remote work right now. And the whole digital nomad idea is pretty alive and well at Fraym, at least. Like I have a couple of colleagues that have just they have not ever been in one place for more than a month because they don't have to be. And they're, early 20s and they want to go explore. And it doesn't matter because as long as they can be online when we need them to be and working, it doesn't really matter where they are. I think my husband actually works for a company that's very similar. They have a huge workforce and everybody right now is remote. So I think that gives people way more flexibility about where they get a job because I remember when I first graduated, I was like, I don't want to move to like Washington, DC, which is what I was thinking at the time. And I actually even had a job offer and I was like, I don't know if I really want to move there. Now I'd be like, sure, totally. Can I work from home? Like, I don't think that's going to be as big of a barrier for people. Where you will have bigger barriers, I think, is that networking aspect, because in person, you get those connections so much easier. And then if you go remote, you're able to keep them. And I've worked remotely now for 10 years. So I lived in the DC area for a really long time. I lived in Illinois. I lived all over, but I've lived back in Vermont for 11, 12 years. And it's the hardest I've had in the last 2 years, because I don't regularly go back to my headquarters and see my people that I work with. And so, like, you know, when you're only ever working with your team through Zoom, that's kind of weird. But I guess you guys are already experiencing that, because it's probably been the same for classes. And people are starting to come back in person, but there's no demand for people to be in person. So I think it's more of an opportunity, because it's allowing people more flexibility. There's going to be the two skill sets, the hard skills and the soft skills. And for data analytics, this cuts really two ways. One, when we're looking at CV or resumes for people and we're trying to think about who to hire, there's certain skill sets that we want. So I'm just going to speak for Fraym right now, because other places I've worked, we've required different skills, but like, we're looking for people who have solid backgrounds in R. We want some Python. We want people who have GIS skills. It doesn't matter if it's QGIS or Esri, or if you have, you know, remote sensing, it doesn't really matter. But having had exposure to that, even having had some R, spatial R is fine. And econometrics, people who can understand statistical analysis. And as undergrads, you know, that is going to be more limited for sure than a graduate student, but even exposure to that is fine. Then there's that whole other realm of the soft skills that I mentioned before. And I think something that, I don't know if we're going to talk about like resumes and cover letters. I never bought the fact that people only spent mere seconds looking at resumes until like the last 5 years, where I spend mere seconds looking at resumes. And I was always one of those people that was like, oh, but you really need to tell them your story through your resume. And then you have like literally dozens of resumes you're going through, and I go through very quickly and I look for certain things. And I want to see right up front that they have the skills that we need in terms of the technical stuff, that I want to know what their education was, and I want to know what soft skills they have. And the soft skills come out of in the cover letter. And how you phrase your cover letter, I think, is actually almost as important as your resume. And I've seen so many cover letters that are stock, like, dear sir or ma'am, like, I'm so excited to apply to your position. And then like, they don't even fill in the title. Here are why I'm so awesome. And that's it. And then there's the ones that are like, I'm so excited about Fraym. I went on your website and I learned that you're doing XYZ. And I think that my skill set in fill in the blank would be super useful towards that goal. And like, they've actually spent time thinking about us and what we do and the job. And that, for me, I'm like, woo, put this one higher up. Like, I want to see that one go to the top, because this person did some research and they're actually interested in Fraym. So that's like a little piece of advice. Yeah, so the other thing that's interesting is that there's all kinds of formatting tools you can use now. And something I did not realize is that if you put your resume in this like super cool looking format, it's really good for like the human eye. But if you are submitting it to a place that uses some kind of a system to pull out information, it can't read it. So as boring as it is, I would definitely do a format that's like standard boring, so that if there's stuff in there, it will be pulled out. And I mean, right now as undergrads, you're going to want to put in things that are like, you know, the coursework that's relevant and your major and any internship experience you've had, and any kind of opportunities you can show that you've had more exposure outside of school. But then honestly, once you start having a couple of experiences that are beyond school, I don't even really look at the coursework anymore, because for me, it's less important that you took, you know, whatever the computer science or geography class was, but it's more important to me that you have a knowledge or experience or exposure to something. And in international development, one of the tricky things is there's this catch-22 where you need experience in order to get jobs that are working internationally, and it's hard to get those jobs without having had experience. And I mean, Peace Corps is like the biggest win. Before I was working in data analytics and I was working more broadly within development and I was hiring people for different kinds of things, if I saw Peace Corps on somebody's resume, I was very excited because I was like, they understand what it's like to live in a community that we're working with. If people had an opportunity to travel at all to other cultures or they're from another culture, that was like also really high on the list of exciting things. If you can't, because you've never had that opportunity, showing a fascination and an interest in that is also useful. And that also comes out in like cover letters and interviews, because it's not necessarily critical, but it's, you know, something that if we're working in places with people who don't have very good data or are, you know, we're working with a community that has a need, it's better to have some understanding of what that's going to look like for you to be able to relate in some way. So the question was, how do we make sure that the data that we're working with is quality data, since a lot of the places that we're working in may have problems with their data? Is that a valid? So it's such a problem. And one of the things that we've done previously is to work with those data sets that are the industry standard for international data sets. That said, there's like a massive caveat that they have problems. And in some, they have all kinds of metadata about how they were verified, how they were statistically accurate, how they've done all the checks, which regions have specific problems and why you shouldn't weight this, you know, use this population weight here. So we go with all of that, but then we also talk to people locally. And so we know in certain countries, there's pretty big problems with those data sets. And that's one of the reasons that we started using our own. And in our own case, we can have more control over how the data is asked, how the data is captured, what we ask to try to alleviate some of the problems that we know exist in existing data, that sort of thing. It is a problem. It's something that we're really aware of, and we work a lot within the responsible use data community to try to figure out how to better capture that and how to make sure that the data we're using and the modeling that we're using is not biasing the data any more than it already is biased. Because the data is all going to be biased. It's just, you know, making sure you're aware of that. And then we will often explain the limitations of the data when we do our products and our presentations, and we'll say, here's what we found, here's the caveats, and know that this is a problem in this area. So that's kind of where we're at in terms of how we deal with it.
Hi, my name is Ola, and I wanted to ask, how did you know you wanted to go to graduate school? Like, what were the pros and cons when you were making that decision?
So I really didn't know anything about graduate school when I was probably a sophomore. And as a junior, I started to learn more about it and understand the benefits. And then I was like, I need a break. I can't go straight from this into graduate school. And I didn't even fully realize that that was important until about a month after I graduated. Your seniors, you're going to totally go through this soon. I was like, oh my God, I'm free. Like this huge stress came off. And you know, Middlebury is super rigorous and you all know that, but like, I didn't really get that until I suddenly had no more responsibility. And then I was like, I'm free. And that lasted for like 6 months. And then I was like, these jobs I'm getting, I don't love them. And I don't really like what I'm doing. And I looked at a lot of the jobs that I wanted, and I was looking at like things that sounded exciting, and the entry-level jobs all required a master's degree. And I was like, how is this entry level? I'm sure you guys are seeing this now. And so because of that, I started thinking, okay, I probably need to go back and get a degree. I didn't really know what that meant or what I wanted. So I started to think about it and I was like, you know what? I just want to get a master's right now, but I want to go through a program where if I change my mind, like they have a really good PhD program. So I got into the master's program. I went to the University of Illinois for graduate school and I went to DC. And after a few years in DC working for this nonprofit, doing really cool work, I was doing a lot of researchy stuff, and a lot of the proposals that we were on required a PI, and you had to have a PhD. And I was working with people with PhDs, and I was starting to think I might want to go back and get a PhD. And my husband and I were chatting about. I was like, Penn State is really where I want to go. He's from Pennsylvania. He's like, really? I don't really want to go there. Maybe like. So I started going to the Association of American Geographers conferences and stalking professors that were teaching what I thought I'd like to do. And I gave it like a year or two. And I like stalked their grad students. Like there was one professor I was really interested in that did climate adaptation. And I was like, I think I could see myself doing this. But then my job changed where I was and I liked what I was doing more. And I saw the direction altering from just doing more social researchy stuff to more like technology oriented analytics and data science. And I went that way. And then it didn't matter. And the kind of work I did, I didn't personally need a PhD. And so that's why I decided not to go back. And I actually think it was the right decision. That said, it is definitely likely that you will need a graduate degree to do something later on in the data analytics world, data science world. And data science is a little bit different than data analytics. I also didn't quite understand this until a few years ago. Data science is a lot more heavy duty on the modeling and on the theoretical ways that you might approach a problem. And they tend to have our team is about half PhDs and half master's degrees, whereas our analytics side is all over the place. We don't have anyone with a PhD. We have a couple people with bachelor's degrees, and then we have everybody else has a master's, but they have like MPAs, which a master's of public administration or a master's of public policy, or they have, like a master's of arts, or they have a master's of science. It's a really different group than our data scientists, which come out of like computer science, engineering, and a couple of geographers. I would say taking a break between undergrad and grad on the job front is really good because it shows that you've gotten some real world experience. If someone goes straight through, we've hired people that have done that. They usually come in at a more junior level because they have a lot of academic experience, but they don't have a lot of experience. So they don't really know what it's like to work in the work culture. And it's different. Like, working 9 to 5 with a team is a lot different than working on a team for a project in a class. And the cadence of like having to have these crunch periods to get a project accomplished and then still working on other things. There's no break like there is in an academic year where there are clean breaks between semesters and something ends and then something else starts. So that's just something to get used to. And we like to see that people have like worked a little before they come and work for us. That's not to say that we don't hire people straight out of school. Like I showed with Miles, he just graduated in February and this is his first job. James had graduated from Middlebury and then moved to Utah and got like a job in Salt Lake doing something with LiDAR and then is now working for Fraym. So, it just depends on the individual. But I think personally, it's a lot better for you also just to get a sense for what you might want to do. And also, I definitely agree that if you have a little bit of a break between your undergraduate and your grad program, you have a better sense for what you want to focus on. And I think like I definitely used that time to research people and programs, but also just take a break and have like a normal existence for a year or two, or at night my stuff was done and I didn't have to worry about homework. And then I went to bed and got up the next morning and I was like, oh, okay, I can start my day. And I didn't have anything like hanging over me. It's kind of nice.
But you were mentioning how when you're looking at a resume from someone who has like international experience, that can be a really big plus. And as someone who's kind of like I'm like a first year Feb, so I'm
Yep.
like just getting started in this like whole professional world. But how do you like to see that come across? Do you have any tips for like how to bring those kinds of things up in a resume or in an interview and like kind of make yourself stand out in that sense?
When you're in your, if it happens outside of school, it's easier to put it into a cover letter. If it's school related, I would definitely put like under education, if you do a study abroad program, put the program you did and the year or the dates or whatever. I've actually learned recently that I don't know if this is a new thing or if it's only because now I'm older and they tell you not to put dates on stuff, but like as you get older, they tell you not to put dates on stuff because they don't want you to like to show ageism. I was like, oh, because I guess I'm not supposed to put like the year I graduated from college anymore because then it makes me look really old. But I think for younger people, you're supposed to. This is weird. But I would still put like if you go to like a study abroad program, put it in there and put like the year. I used to put on my resume in the very beginning, I was like trying to show any experience I could in international, and I did not travel much at all. But I did do a J-term class to Bangladesh, which was amazing. It was in the history department, and someone got like a grant, and then could take, I think it was like 6 students, and we applied to go, and then we got selected. So it was the first time I'd ever left North America, and I was a senior before my super senior year because I was a Feb 2. And that thing was on my resume probably for a decade. I would put like under my education, I would put like, Middlebury College and the date and my major and stuff. And then underneath that, I would put like, Bangladesh, January 2000 or 2001 or something. So I would say any opportunity you have to add in where you've gone or what you've done, even if it's for a short period of time, put it on there. You can even add a line that's like international experience and then like list the countries. A lot of times for a lot of undergrads, it's more Europe because that's just where they've had opportunities to go. And, for us, we're looking also for people who have had experience in the developing world. So any opportunities to throw that in there too is good. But then again, getting that experience is kind of hard. That was one of the things that I like. My goal when I first got into international development, like when I first graduated from graduate school, was to try to get cred in like the international world because I had so little travel experience coming into that, and just like basically going wherever I could to try to show that I could be sent wherever and do whatever, which was important for me at the time.
As an international student, I'm also a senior, so I've been looking for jobs recently. It's a lot of times it's a big barrier that you're not a citizen to get a lot of jobs that have like federal contracts, for example. So I was wondering what sort of outlooks you see for people that cannot get a job because there's those like citizen limitations in this like international development sector in the US.
So it depends partly on the kind of visa you're on. I can't remember which ones are which, but there's the STEM visa that allows you to stay for 3 years. And then there's like the one where you can stay for like a year. So when I worked in the nonprofit world in international development, we rarely were able to bring on people who had visas because to sponsor them was too hard for the nonprofit. They just didn't have the funding, and it was really hard to go through the paperwork. On the contracting side, it was a little bit easier, but they were usually more senior. They were like people who had degrees that were graduate degrees, and they were like experts. Now at Fraym, we've actually taken a different approach to this. So I think it's very company specific. We have a lot of positions where we will say upfront, we will ask what your visa status is and if you're a citizen. If you aren't, we will look into whether or not you're okay starting off in the US until you can't stay any longer, and then working remotely from wherever, and then potentially sponsoring you to come and stay in the US. And we've done this successfully right now for someone on my team from India. And it was awesome. Like when it cleared, we had like a huge celebration. She just moved to the US, actually back from India last weekend. And we have like I'm going to DC next week, and we have like a big happy hour for her. It's so exciting. we also had certain jobs where, like you were saying, they were with the government and it was, you had to be a US citizen to work on the projects. And so for those, we would just put a caveat in them, like, you have to be a US citizen to apply for this particular job. But it really is gonna depend on the company, and it also will depend on how eager they are to bring you on for your skill sets, because in our case, we were just looking for the best person. We weren't looking for just US citizens. And we have a lot of people hired at Fraym that are not US citizens. And some of them live abroad and some of them live in the US.
So I absolutely recommend kind of reaching out to Carmen.
Yep, sure.
With the email, but also reaching out to the CCI and continuing to go to these events from different Middlebury alums. And yes, I'm just very appreciative.
Thank you so much. This is great. Thanks for coming.